And now, Magnus, Rook takes e3. He is going for the kill. In this video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Hans Niemann with an insane Rook sacrifice at the 2022 Airthings Masters prelims. Now in the game, Hans Niemann is playing as white. He opens 1c4 and Magnus Carlsen responds 1g6, the modern defense. Now knight c3 and c5. Now Magnus heading for a symmetrical English. Now here Hans Niemann, knight to f3, bishop g7 for Magnus Carlsen. And now e3, Hans Niemann perhaps intending d4, a very solid idea against black's fianchetto-based setup here on the king side. Now here Magnus, knight to f6, and then d4 for Hans, and here in this position, Magnus takes on d4, by far the best move, Hans Niemann takes back, and then here instead of d5, the strongest idea and sort of a Grunewald-style move, here Magnus just castles on the king side, a very provocative idea, because now Hans Niemann can just expand in the center with the move d5, a very strong idea, and now Hans Niemann does have a permanent space advantage in the middle of the board. However, Magnus Carlsen, this is what he wanted. He wanted a very imbalanced position because he knows he can outplay Hans Niemann any day of the week. Here, e6 on the board for Magnus, chopping down that very strong pawn on the d5 square, and now Hans, bishop e2, e takes, c takes, and then d6. So now we have a transformation of the pawn structure in this English opening position. Here the pawns on d5 and d6 are the main imbalance. Of course, Hans Niemann does have the space advantage. However, that pawn on d5 could become a weakness if Magnus Carlsen manages to attack it. And beyond that, that bishop on g7 for Magnus Carlsen is very, very active in this position. Now from here, Hans Niemann, he plays a waiting move, h3, stopping bishop g4 ideas from Magnus. Not a bad idea. Magnus goes rook to e8, developing the rook on the open e-file. Now castles, knight d7, and here Hans Niemann, he plays the move bishop e3. A very logical idea. His plan may include queen d2 and then bishop h6, trying to trade off black's very strong bishop on the g7 square. However, Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, he was not going to allow this. He was in a very disrespectful mood in this game. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen plays one of the most disrespectful rook sacrifices you will ever see in your entire life. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he just gives up the rook for that bishop on e3. Boom, rook takes e3 on the board. And it turns out this is actually not that bad of a move. It's very playable, not the strongest idea, but certainly very playable. Now, here's the idea. Hans Niemann, of course, he has to recapture on e3. F takes e3 on the board. And now here, real fast, let's do inventory. Here, Magnus Carlsen did give up the rook for the bishop. However, he did damage white's pawn structure. And beyond that, that pawn on e3 is a big weakness. And Magnus Carlsen can attack it with moves like queen d7 and maybe bishop h6, piling up the pressure. Now here in the game, Magnus does go queen d7, targeting that weak pawn on the e3 square, and Hans Niemann, he knows if he goes queen d2 trying to defend, then that could run into bishop h6 ideas, and that pawn would be pinned to the queen, and it would be attacked twice. Beyond that, Hans can go queen d3 trying to defend, but that runs into knight to c5, a very strong move, gaining a tempo on the queen. So, with that in mind, here Hans, he just goes king to h2, getting the king off this semi-exposed diagonal here, and simply allowing Magnus Carlsen to take that pawn on e3. But does Magnus Carlsen take it? Before I answer that real fast, if you're enjoying this video, please smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. Now, back to the game. Here, Magnus Carlsen, surprisingly, he does not take on e3. Instead, knight to c5 is the move for Magnus. And what's the idea? Well, he's just giving Hans Niemann the chance to defend the pawn with queen d2. That is what happens in the game. And now Magnus just goes bishop d7. He's actually not going bishop h6 right away, trying to win back the pawn. And my best guess is here Magnus Carlsen, he believes if he can keep the position as complicated as possible, it's going to be that much easier to outplay his lower-rated opponent, Hans Niemann. So that is my best guess, trying to maintain the tension and keep the game complicated. Now here in this position, bishop d3 for Hans Niemann, a very reasonable move. The idea being you want to follow up rook a to e1, supporting the pawn with yet another piece. Now here Magnus, rook to e8 on the board, and then Hans Niemann, rook a to e1. Again, both players piling up all of their pieces on this pawn on the e3 square, that being the key piece in this position. Now here Magnus, bishop to h6, further increasing the pressure, and now Hans Niemann, he has a very big choice. You either get the queen out of the attack of that pawn on e3 right away, or you do something else. Now here, moves like queen c2 and queen d1 are very, very playable. Magnus will likely win that pawn on the e3 square. However, here Hans Niemann, he is still up the full exchange. He has the extra rook versus the extra minor piece of Magnus Carlsen, and that means he will still be better after either queen d1 or queen to c2. Instead here, he expands on the queen side with the very interesting idea b4, trying to knock back that knight from the c5 square right away. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, obviously, if he goes, say, knight to a6, that'll be a very, very passive square for the knight. So instead, he jumps into the e4 square. Knight to e4, the best move. And now Hans Niemann can trade with either the bishop or the knight, and both moves will likely transpose or reach a very similar position. Now in the game, Hans takes with the bishop takes e4, then knight takes e4 for Magnus Carlsen. And here Hans, instead of recapturing on e4 right away, he plays a very interesting idea, queen d4, trying to get the queen out of the attack of the knight, and the idea being, if the knight takes on c3, the queen takes back, and here Hans Niemann is just trying to make it more difficult for Magnus Carlsen to activate his pieces. Of course, if he instead captured on e4 with the knight, then Magnus would go queen takes e4, activating the queen. So, queen d4 is a play by Hans Niemann to try and keep Magnus Carlsen's pieces less active, especially that queen on e7. Now here, Magnus, he has a wide variety of moves he could play. For example, you can bolster that knight on the e4 square with either the bishop f5, or the f-pawn with the move f5. Instead here, he simply takes the knight on c3, knight takes c3 on the board, then queen takes, and then Magnus, the very strong idea, bishop b5, putting pressure on that rook on the f1 square. Real fast, there were other ideas. For example, queen to e4 comes to mind. Bishop f5, also very playable. But instead, Magnus Carlsen's move from the game, bishop b5, putting pressure on the rook, was a much better choice. And now Hans Niemann, if he wants to keep that extra rook, he's going to have to move the rook in this position. But where do you move it? Well, it turns out if you go rook to g1 or rook to h1, those moves are very, very weak. For example, rook g1, and then black can simply take on e3 with the bishop, pressuring the rook once again, and the rook, besides being attacked, is completely out of the game. So that would not be a good idea. Instead, rook to f2 on the board for Hans Niemann, the best idea. And now Magnus Carlsen, what is he going to do to increase the pressure? Obviously, he is down the full exchange in this position. He's got to keep the attack going if he wants to survive. Well, he's got a few different ideas here. The computer likes the idea of queen to e4, trying to centralize the queen. However, Magnus, as usual, he tries to maintain the tension with a more complicated idea, bishop g7. Now, this move retreats the bishop, gets it back to the long diagonal where it is a little bit more active, and pressures the queen on c3. However, the drawback of this move is it does release the pressure on that e3 pawn. So here, Magnus Carlsen is saying, I'm going to play down the exchange long term. I'm not even going to win back a pawn for a while, and I think I can still outplay Hans no matter what. Well, let's see if it works out that way in the game. Here, queen to c2 from Hans Niemann, getting out of the attack of the bishop. And here, Magnus, as usual, showing his flair with a very creative attacking idea, h5, expanding on the king's side. Potentially, he's threatening h4 at some point in the future, or even g5, then g4, trying to blow up in the king's side. And that idea would be especially dangerous. And starting it with h5 is a very safe, risk-free way to get that strategy going without weakening the king's side too much in advance. So h5, a very strong idea by Magnus. Now here, Hans Niemann, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out this is a good chance to go e4, expanding in the center and trying to get that pawn defended by the rook on the e1 square. And of course, queen takes e4 is not going to be a possibility. So e4 here would have been a strong idea. Instead, Hans Niemann goes for a different one, a4, expanding on the queen side and trying to push back that bishop on b5. However, this turns out to be a little bit weaker, as here after bishop d7 by Magnus Carlsen in this game, that bishop is a little bit better placed on d7 than it was on b5. Now here, Hans Niemann, what should he be doing? In the game, he does go e4, so finding the right idea just to move too late, and now Magnus Carlsen, rook to c8, putting pressure on that queen on c2. So, very solid idea. Obviously, the rook is not going to be doing a whole lot on the e-file now that the pawn on e4 is supported by the rook on the e1 square. So, Magnus just rerouting his rook to a better file here, that being the c-file where it pressures the queen. And now, where should the queen be going? Well, as usual, it is better to have the queen centralized in this position, and for that reason, something like queen d3 may be the simplest solution. However, instead, here Hans Niemann goes for a different square, queen to b3, and this turns out to be a little bit weaker as it is further over on the queen side and away from the center of the board. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he has at least two different very strong ideas to fight for the advantage on the spot in this position. Now here, the first idea, the strongest one, and we talked about this before in the game, is going to be g5, expanding on the king's side, threatening g4, and the pawn on g5 will be supported by the queen, so knight takes g5 is not a possibility. However, instead of that, here Magnus goes for a different idea, rook to c3, very flashy, the second flashy rook move we've seen so far in this game. Now, obviously, the rook is being supported by the bishop on g7, therefore queen takes c3 is not a possibility. and Hans Niemann, he has to move the queen. In the game, he goes queen d1, the best square for the queen. However, if he had the queen on d3 instead of b3, and then if Magnus went rook c3, he'd have the option of queen d2, and from d2, that queen would eye the very important g5 square, stopping g5 ideas. So that is just one of the reasons why d3 may have been a better square than b3 way back here when the queen was on c2. But instead, queen d1 on the board for Hans Niemann. And now Magnus, instead of going g5, again, that is the strongest idea here. Instead, he goes rook to c4, putting pressure on that pawn on the b5 square. And now here, Hans Niemann, after a couple of inaccurate moves by Magnus Carlsen, again, Magnus missing that g5 idea. Here, Hans Niemann, he shows his brilliance. He finds a very, very strong idea. And by the way, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find this very powerful 1-2 punch by Hans Niemann. All right, I hope you found it. Here, Hans Niemann, he breaks in the center with the move e5, a very strong idea. Now, you may be wondering, why did he do this? Isn't black just defending the pawn 3 times with the bishop, the pawn, and the queen versus the 2 of Hans Niemann? Well, that is correct. However, here's the idea. First of all, if you take with the bishop, you cannot give up your precious dark squared bishop and the bishop pair. The knight takes, and from there, Hans Niemann is going to be rolling. Instead, Magnus takes with the d-pawn. D takes e5, the best move. But now Hans Niemann, this is his idea. He goes d6, expanding in the center and pushing back the black queen. Now, queen to f6 on the board. And here, Hans Niemann, he has a wide variety of moves he could play. For example, rook takes e5 right away is playable. But instead, Hans jumps in with his queen to the d5 square, queen d5 on the board. And now Hans Niemann, again, pressuring e5 with the queen, the knight, and the rook. He's having all sorts of ideas here. Now, Magnus Carlsen, rook to c6, pressuring the pawn on the d6 square. That pawn may fall. Now Hans Niemann, he takes on e5 with the queen. Queen takes e5. And then Magnus takes on d6 with the queen. Queen takes d6. And finally, the queens come off the board. Queen takes, rook takes. And now we have an endgame, but this is not any ordinary endgame. First of all, it's a Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann endgame. You don't want to miss this. But beyond that, we have a very important imbalance in this position. Here, Hans Niemann is up the exchange. However, Magnus Carlsen does have the extra pawn on the king side, and more importantly, the very powerful bishop pair. Magnus is one of the best players in the world with the bishop pair. He is just a monster with these guys, and we're going to see how to use them in the endgame here with this masterclass of the endgame by Magnus Carlsen. Now, Hans Niemann, knight g5, very strong move, immediately pressuring that weak f7 point with the rook and the knight in the endgame. Now, bishop f6 attacks the knight and blocks the attack of the rook on f7. Knight to e4, forking the rook and the bishop, and it may look like Magnus Carlsen is losing the bishop pair here, but he is not, because bishop e5 hits the king with check. The king has to move, and then rook d4, and suddenly both the bishop and the rook are out of the attack, and Magnus Carlsen is putting pressure on the knight on the e4 square. Now, rook d2, Hans Niemann offering the rook trade on d2. Magnus Carlsen declines. He goes bishop takes a4, just winning a free pawn on the queen side. Now Hans trades rooks, rook takes, bishop takes, and suddenly Magnus Carlsen, he is up 2 full pawns in this position. He also has the opportunity to make a pass pawn on the queen side with those A and B pawns. And meanwhile, Hans Niemann, he does have the rook, but again, those bishops on d4 and a4 are just so powerful for Magnus Carlsen in this position. So let's see what Hans Niemann's going to do from here to hang on. Now, Hans Niemann, his turn to move. He goes knight d6, setting up threats on the b7 pawn and maybe s7 in the future. And Magnus bishop c3, forking both the rook on e1 and that pawn on the b4 square. Now, rook to e4 gets out of the attack and defends b4, but then Magnus b5, expanding on the queen side, setting up a5 threats. And if he wins that pawn on the b4 square in the future, those pawns are going to be insanely powerful. Now Hans Niemann, rook e8, hits the king, king g7, then rook e7. Hans Niemann pressuring the f7 point, that being the weak point in Magnus Carlsen's position. But that means bishop takes b4, the pawn on b4 is undefended, and Magnus Carlsen wins it with the attack on the knight and the rook. All right, here Hans Niemann, rook takes f7, hitting the king, but then king to h6, getting out of the attack. And here again, Magnus has those 2 pass pawns on the queen side, defended by the bishops. They're going to be escorted down the board. Now here, Hans Niemann, the best move for him, believe it or not, is going to be knight takes b5, giving up the knight. In return, you try to win 2 pawns, that being the pawn on b5, and then the pawn on a7 after bishop takes b5. And from there, with the rook versus the two bishops, Hans Niemann may be able to hold on in the endgame. But instead here, he does not do that. He goes knight to e4, and this move turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Here, Magnus a5, expanding on the queen side, and then h4 for Hans Niemann, trying to lock down the king side, but it's too little too late. Here, bishop b3, and Magnus, he's going to escort that pawn all the way down the board to the a1 square. All right, Hans Niemann, rook a7, trying to defend, but then a4. Now Hans Niemann, g4, an excellent move, trying to counterplay on the king side, and actually threatening g5 checkmate in one move. All right, Magnus, he sees the threat. H takes g4 on the board. He's not going a3 and then g5 checkmate. That'd be a disaster. Instead, H takes g4 on the board. And now Hans, knight to f6, again threatening checkmate on h7 with the rook. All right, Magnus, he spots this. g5. He does not fall for that disrespectful checkmate on the h7 square. g5, then h5 for Hans Niemann. Again, setting up rook to h7 as the pawn on h5 defended by the knight, and the g5 square defended by the pawn. So what should Magnus Carlsen do? Bishop c2 on the board, then king g2 on the board for Hans Niemann. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead, rook to a6 was necessary. And now Magnus, bishop c3, and now these pawns will be escorted down the board with almost zero issues. All right, Hans Niemann, knight g8, trying to hit the king, but then king takes h5, wins the pawn, and here Hans goes rook to a6, again threatening checkmate on the a6 square, the h6 square, but then bishop b4 hits the king, king g3, bishop b5 hits the king again, king f2, then g3, giving the king the escape square on g4, king goes to e3, and here in this position, g2, Magnus Carlsen pushing pawns on literally all sides of the board, and here in this position on move 34, Hans Niemann resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, please smash the like button. Thank you so much for doing that. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.